Hello and welcome. My name is Marianne Broxton, and I am the main representative to the United Nations for the International Movement ATD Fourth World. Before we start and I introduce our moderator for today's discussion, I'd like to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and this will be available later on this week online. So if you have, please feel free to share it with your colleagues and your networks who were unable to be with us today. You will notice that you are on mute if you're an attendee. That way, our panelists can speak freely without having any background noise. So please, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will be answering them later on today. So let's get started. We are very fortunate today to have Ms. Celine Fabre-Pierre, Counselor to the Permanent Mission of Haiti to the United Nations, moderating this panel discussion today. Ms. Fabre-Pierre studied international relations and diplomacy at the University Catolicia de Santo Domingo, law at the University de Tar de Tahiti. I'm sorry, my French is not very well. And is currently pursuing a master's degree in international relations and diplomacy. In 2012, she joined the Haiti Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in 2019, she was transferred to Haiti's permanent mission to the United Nations. Ms. Fabre, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar discussion, Eliminating Inequity and Systemic Exclusion, a right-based approach to social and economic policy justice. As Marianne said, my name is Celine Fabre-Pierre, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's discussion. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has stated, halfway to the deadline for the 2030 agenda, we are leaving more than half the world behind. Here is what we currently know. 50% of progress on the goals is considered insufficient, while 30% of progress has regressed. Globally, 453 million people who wanted to work in 2022 could not find employment. For the 712 million people who were able to find work and the formal economy employment didn't guarantee sustainability for themselves or their families. At the end of 2022, 1.6 billion people lived in inadequate housing. At the same time, restrictive austerity measures are dismantling social protection, increasing inequality, and pushing people deeper into poverty. Currently, an estimated 1 in 6 people globally experience gender, ethnic, religious, or age-based discrimination. Discrimination based on socioeconomic standing or povertyism is not currently measured. Those are the facts. But today, we are going to discuss the ways in which to create an alternative, equitable, social policy best practices to ensure we are no longer leaving more than half the world's population behind. Now, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. We have Ms. Lauren Kelly, Mr. Jimmy Power, Mr. Olivier De Schutter, Ms. Jane Quinn, Ms. Hyphy Finch Floyd. Ms. Kelly is a community activist with ATD Fourth World Ireland. She has been at the forefront of campaigning on socioeconomic discrimination, lobbying for the Add the 10th initiative in Ireland, and has taken part in many of ATD Ireland's actions, including poverty hour practice with social workers, students, and lockdown liberties. Mr. Jimmy Power is also a community activist with ATD Fourth World Ireland. He is part of the Irish 70th October Committee, Lockdown Liberties, and has been a strong advocate against socioeconomic discrimination as a lobbyist for the Add the 10th campaign in Ireland. Mr. Olivier De Schutter is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He's a professor of law at UC Louvain and at Sciences Po Paris, and is the former Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH. Ms. Jean Quinn is the Executive Director of Unanima International, Chair of the NGO Committee for Social Development. She is also the founder of Sophia Housing Ireland and a former co-chair of the Working Group to End Homelessness. Ms. Hi-Faye Finch-Floyd is the Director of Economic Justice at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Her work focuses on promoting economic security and justice. Ms. Floyd's contribution will be by video as she's lobbying at the Georgia State House for Economic Justice Policy today. And we thank her for still being able to contribute to this important conversation. Ms. Kelly and Mr. Power, the floor is now yours. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you for this opportunity. You do not need eyes to see poverty. And what I mean by this is you can smell it. Some parts of Dublin we call the posh places. It's clean, the air is clean. But if you go into the city centre, you smell rubbish, you smell the homeless because they don't have the facilities to even take care of themselves. Socioeconomic discrimination impacts access to basic human rights. Discrimination is making somebody feel worthless and making judgments about a person based on the area they come from. We don't feel like we get treated the same respect. This also affects families because it could be based on poverty, it could be based on exclusion and access to particular services, and in a lot of rural areas on a surname. Social economic status impacts across many generations, and it can take many generations to break that cycle. I'm going to give you some real life stories from people I've met over the years, including myself, of socioeconomic discrimination. I was an addict and I got clean. I was on a very small amount of methadone. I got pregnant and I wasn't allowed to continue to reduce. I had to stay on it. When I was in hospital, I noticed nurses helping other mothers, even taking babies so the mothers could rest, while I was left in a corner isolated with no help. I was in hospital when a social worker came to my bed. I wanted to run out the door with my baby because I thought they were coming to take my child. I feel because I was on methadone that I was judged by these nurses. I know loads of women and men who were housed, but when they go and try to get a job in Ireland, you need experience. So these people had no choice but to get a social welfare payment. The inner city people never stood a chance. We've been getting put down for years by the media. We were called the commoners. You see, not everyone even got a chance to finish school. I know a girl who failed a spelling test, and after that she was put to the back of the classroom and wasn't allowed to participate in any other spelling tests. She said it was like the teacher gave up on her and didn't want to put in the extra help. Our government has the money to fix some of these problems, but instead they want to make bicycle lanes on roads. They want to fix little potholes on pathways, but will step over a homeless person to do so. And that I can't understand. Ireland is losing itself, and we the people cannot let this happen. Not just our country, but every country. A last example, a woman recently quit her job. She was working in a private creche in a posh area, but none of the staff engaged with her. They would go to lunch and leave her on her own. There was no communication between staff and her. She felt this was because she came from the inner city and the way we speak. They look down their noses at us like we're dirt. I will continue to fight this so my children never have to experience socio-economic discrimination like we have. We have many more examples like this in our Breaking Barriers report. Discrimination has many long-term and serious impacts. People fall into a trap of intergenerational poverty, let down from grandparents to parents to children. And even the youth get targeted by the Gardaí if they wear expensive clothing. The Gardaí want to know how they paid for those clothes. When there are parents out here that are hard working and their children are coming home crying because they can't wear a jacket because they're being discriminated against. Thank you again for this opportunity.
My name is Shimmy Power. I'm a community activist with HCD. I've been introduced to HCD 15 years ago, which is Fights Against Anti-Poverty campaign. We as an organisation decided to take action on that attempt to fight against social economic discrimination. We were part of an alliance which called Advocates Attempt. This group was working on have social economy recognised as the 10th ground of the discrimination of equal legislations. Those who live in poverty walk the shield of poverty. Discrimination could be due to the way you speak, your culture, your background, or the way you look. I feel this is the time to stand up to policies and to make the final decision to stop all discrimination. We have to have a social media campaign where we ask people to take pictures of the jigsaw. This is the missing 10th ground. This campaign is involved with people in every county and has gone international. We have done lectures in Trinity College, Galway, and other conferences. During the lectures, we spoke about the campaign and educated them about discrimination. We spoke to social workers, students, about what it is like to have a social worker in your life and about leaving the care system. People should have know their rights about leaving the care system and making sure that they're equals our care system and make sure that they know their entitlements. This is to help stop judgmental between the social worker and the people who work with them. There has to be respect. Action helps prevent discrimination beyond the legal protection, and we have brought a campaign to the Irish government, to the EU and the UN. I feel about raising the voice and being heard. The campaign has been in the doll voted by the Irish ministers in 2023. Although not successful, it's back on the agenda for 24. This will never be shut down, and we feel that the benefit, but this goes beyond Ireland, European. Because at the end of the day, we're all human and reality. We've done many projects raising awareness of discrimination, but most of our recent work is breaking barriers reports. The report just understand what discrimination feels like. This brings people together, the voice who live the experience of discrimination economy and professionals. This the most important part of the campaign has been about listening to those who have been living in poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren and Jimmy. We want to remember, as Lauren and Jimmy said, discrimination has serious and long-term impact on people's lives. and those who live in poverty are marked by poverty. Thanks to you both for highlighting the harmful effects of socioeconomic discrimination on individual and society. Thank you again. I would like to ask the panelists to share brief thoughts on Lauren and Jimmy's contribution. Ms. Queen or Mr. Shooter?
Thank you, Lorraine and Jimmy. There is the sincerity in the voice, and as I was privileged to speak at the opening of the Commission on Social Development at the United Nations yesterday, I reiterate what I say all the time, and you've just said now, don't talk about us without us, because you are the experts in this area. And I was quite taken by what you said at the beginning, Lorraine, and it stopped me in my tracks. You don't need eyes to see poverty, you smell it. Now, I see that here every day, but you've put the words to what I see and probably couldn't put the words to it. You smell it. And there's different ways of smelling that. That is going to stay with me.
Thank you, Jean. Mr. Shooter, I don't know if you have some thoughts, brief thoughts.
Yes,
Thank you, Jean, for sharing. Oh,
thank you very much to Lorraine and Jimmy for their testimony. The example you provided, or the words you started with, Lorraine, concerning the smell of poverty, is one that strikes me, because there was one famous example where in France, a family visiting a museum under the guidance or with the support of ATD Fourth World were asked to leave the premises because their odor was disturbing to the other people patronizing the museum. And so they were led to the exit, reimbursed their tickets, and asked to depart. And that very sinister episode was the start of a struggle in France that was successful to prohibit discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage. In other terms, to prohibit what we call povertyism. Mm. We believe that just like racism, sexism, homophobia, povertyism should be outlawed, and that landlords, employers, social services, more broadly, administrations who discriminate people because they are poor should be held accountable, because that is a major reason why people find it difficult to escape poverty. It turns out I dedicated a whole report to the UN to this topic, where I tried to show how anti-discrimination legislation could be used. And I believe it is also very relevant to ensure that poverty is not an obstacle to having access to housing. And I will return to this later, because of course, the more money you have, the more you can afford decent housing, which seems natural. Nevertheless, people who live on social assistance, people who have irregular sources of income, may find it very difficult to have an apartment for rent, for example. And so there's a link between poverty and access to housing, which is often misunderstood. And I will return to this later in my remarks. Many thanks for your testimonies.
Thank you for sharing. Now we will hear again Mr. Olivier de Schutter. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I thought it would be useful in the few minutes I have to highlight the vicious cycles between poverty and inadequate housing, which I already have been alluding to. And this vicious cycle runs both ways. Not only does lack of income or lack of decent work make it difficult for people to have access to housing, which I think is obvious enough, but in addition, poor housing, inadequate housing, makes it more difficult for people to escape poverty. Let me highlight the two causalities. First of all, poverty is an obstacle to have access to housing. This is why people working on the fight against poverty, they work, of course, on the need to provide decent wages, the need to ensure access to social protection. When you have decent incomes, it is, of course, easier to have access to decent housing. But one often overlooked dimension is that people living on low incomes, people depending on social protection or with irregular incomes, may face discrimination in access to housing. And that is, I think, an often underestimated dimension of access to housing. Let me give one example that comes from Quebec in Canada. In Quebec, courts had to intervene because many landlords were excluding prospective tenants seeking to rent an apartment based on assumptions about the ability to pay of people on social assistance, or people such as freelance writers, for example, that were in precarious forms of employment with only irregular income. So what the courts found in Quebec is that these people were able to pay the rent, but the landlords were not ready to trust them, were not certain that people would continuously be able to pay, and thus these people found it very difficult to have access to decent housing. In the United States, people receiving so-called Section 8 vouchers granted to low-income families and individuals living below 50% of the median income in their location, these people, these beneficiaries of Section 8 vouchers, are routinely rejected by house lords. There was, in fact, one study in Philadelphia that showed that 67% of landlords, more than 2/3, refused to consider voucher holders for rented apartments, and the exclusion rates were even higher in certain cities, such as Los Angeles. And the result is that in many neighborhoods, people living on low incomes simply are not allowed to have access to housing, and this leads to, of course, housing segregation in such cities. And this is why the New York human rights law includes lawful source of income as part of the protected grounds of discrimination. In other terms, the New York Human Rights Commission may prohibit landlords from refusing to rent an apartment to people who live on social protection, who depend on social assistance. Now, what we also find is that in some cases, people living in low-income neighborhoods in areas that are disproportionately poor face certain types of discrimination. For example, in Argentina, there was a case in the city of Buenos Aires, the capital, where a telephone provider refused to install internet services at a person's place because it was an impoverished area of Argentina, of Buenos Aires, that was considered a risk zone. In other terms, the service provider did not want to provide services to a particular area that had a bad reputation. Or to take another example, again in Argentina, the Supreme Court found that it was illegal for train services to be less available and less regular in disadvantaged areas compared to wealthier areas. The duty of public service providers was to provide services equivalent in all neighborhoods, whether rich or poor. So this prohibition of discrimination on grounds of poverty has a very important role to play in such circumstances. And it's important to note that that can benefit also people who fear to be expelled from their housing. There was a famous case before the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the UN, a case concerning Belgium. The case is Lorne Walters against Belgium. This person was living in an apartment since 25 years. He was experiencing difficulties in paying his rent, and he was, as a result, expelled from the apartment. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, on the basis of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, considered that he had been victim of discrimination because the Belgian legislation did not take into account the specific circumstances of an older person who was living on low incomes and who found himself unable to pay the rent at some point in time. There was no provision allowing that person to receive support in order to continue to reside in the apartment in which he had been living for 25 years. So these are all examples where being poor is a source of discrimination in access to housing, and this, I strongly believe, should be considered illegal. But the opposite causality is more important to explore and less well understood. Poor housing conditions can make it more difficult to escape poverty. Children, for example, who live in poor housing that is overcrowded, poorly insulated, exposed to polluted and unsafe environments, they will find it much more difficult to thrive and to succeed later in their lives as adults. That is because of housing conditions as such. For example, exposure to high levels of air pollution, particularly where clean energy is inaccessible or regulation insufficient. That is also true where you live in an area which has a poor food environment, where you only can have access to junk foods, unhealthy foods. Your nutrition, therefore, will be less adequate, and that may lead to long-term health problems. Or you may have limited access to green areas for physical exercise and leisure. And this is important. We know about nature deficit disorders that children raised without having access to green areas suffer from. The relationship with nature is extremely important to reduce the risk of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, for example. So for all these reasons, being raised in low-income neighborhoods can make it more difficult for children to escape poverty. Moreover, overcrowded dwellings mean disturbed sleep, tenser family relationships, stress, anxiety, negatively affecting the education of the child and causing depression in some cases. So living in poor neighborhoods, living in inadequate housing conditions may make it much more difficult to escape poverty. Also because when you live in a low-income neighborhood in a segregated context, children have fewer social connections, they attend less quality schools, they lack decent job opportunities as young adults, they may find it more difficult to have access to quality healthcare, so they don't go to preventive healthcare as a result, and that results in a situation in which their social mobility is diminished. And because they are poor, they will have fewer opportunities to overcome that poverty in later life. And I would like to refer in closing to one experience in which low-income families, through a random selection, were given an opportunity to live in better off neighborhoods. And the result was that the social mobility within those families was significantly improved. The households that were able to move to better off areas managed to have more children attend college. The earnings of the children were better in adult life. And that shows that desegregation, that allowing low-income families to move to better, richer, wealthier neighborhoods may have benefits for the children from these households. So that is why poverty is not only an obstacle to adequate housing, it is also the opposite or the reverse. Inadequate housing, living in poor neighborhoods means that it is much more difficult to escape poverty. And it is this intersection I hope that we can continue to discuss in this webinar. Many thanks.
Thank you, Olivier. Thank you for sharing these examples by explaining the importance of adequate housing for people, family in need, among other, with low income, the relation with a best future for the children, their education and health. Thank you again. And again, I would like to ask panelists for brief reflection. Lorraine, Jean, and the floor is yours.
Just kind of what really stood out with me there was the mention about these landlords. We also have a big issue right now in Ireland where it's part of a social scheme and it's called the HAP scheme. And a lot of landlords wouldn't accept this HAP scheme. So a lot of people were left basically in the dust. And I do think that that is something that also needs to be addressed too with the housing. And yeah, that just really registered with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Another thing that stood out was in the local area, buildings, how much buildings get made, built and not using for housing and wasting the content of the building that they build. Like they have closed the shops. They have shops that closed down. They have all different things, houses that was built years ago and then blocked them off and demolished them. All you have to do is just put a bit of paint to one of them and you get someone off the street. So it's very badly over here in Dublin city centre because there's so many shops closed down that that building could have been used, but to get someone off the streets. Like when you're on the streets, you can't claim social benefits. You can't get a put in the bank account. You can't get post office account. But I think that's that needs to be addressed. Like too many empty contained buildings should be put into homes for the homeless.
And also just one more thing that really stood out as well was there's a lot of families that are staying in 1-bedroom hotel rooms with no cooking facilities and down to like the diet and stuff, people's health. Like we struggle a lot with that here in Ireland too. So it seems to be not just Ireland, but across the world, basically, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what Lorraine and Jimmy are saying, you can talk about the world when you talk about Dublin. And I know Dublin very well, and I've worked in Dublin, and I know the situation pretty well. One of the things you said, I think earlier, Lorraine, was about the intergenerational poverty. And if you go back and remember when the government were trying to plan housing and they started building in Tala and they started building in Blanchardstown, away out there, away from family, away from friends, away from the support you talked about, Professor Shooter. And that also then causes a problem because the cycle then continues. You don't want to stay in that place. You know, it's away from everyone I know. And the same thing happened to me when I was in Brazil last year and looking at the housing there. They took us to a place with slums where the people were living off the river. It was fishing was their main occupation. They sold fish and they were able to use it as food as well. So in order to do housing, they built the housing miles and miles from where the people were living, and they never took up that housing. But if they'd asked the people, where should it be and what was needed, they would have occupied that. That was clearly what they were saying. So there's something about exactly what you're both saying, Lorraine and Jimmy, is that we need your expertise. I keep saying this. We need you around the table. We need to hear those stories, because they're not Dublin stories. They're global, they're world stories. So thank you.
Thank you all for adding to the conversation. Our next contribution comes from Ms. Jean Quinn. Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's a subject I'm passionate about, as many people will know, in terms of housing and adequate housing, or inadequate housing, as we've been hearing both from Lorraine and Jimmy. I'm starting out from the ambitious objectives of the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Outlined there is that people who are living in extreme poverty, homeless or displaced, have yet to obtain the most basic of necessities. And you actually have said it, all of you have said it actually: food, healthcare, housing, equitable employment. I think that was something you both said clearly, and social protection. The issue of extreme poverty is complex and difficult, but to my mind, it's solvable. We can solve this. The solution lies in the equation that combines the human and financial capital, because it's really the struggle between the rich and the poor, and it need not be that way. We need a different economy, a more regenerative economy, and sustainable lifestyles that are desperately needed today, especially to empower countries from the global south, all those countries that we know are badly in the need of housing, to build resilience and move towards self-reliance. Again, it's back to, I'm going to the Dublin experience because I know it well. It's getting away from that self-reliance, being independent, being able to live differently. We have a capitalistic intention to control economic power, which has led to a litany of atrocities, domination and oppression, repeating itself throughout human history. Again, what Lorraine said, that intergenerational stuff that continues. We've not learned from history to change for the better, which is quite extraordinary. The lack of learning is the source of many crises we face today, including the housing crisis, which are systemic, emanating from international, political and economic systems that really don't work. And you both gave, and I'm going back to you again because I feel you're the experts in this area, around planning for housing. And that's for governments worldwide, it's not just in Ireland. The current crisis has exacerbated the existing inequalities, and consequently, millions of people are experiencing downward mobility. There's an organization called Forbes that bring out a book every year on what money the world makes, particularly those that have money. And they're talking about the numbers of billionaires before the pandemic was 660. And now it's 2,755 billionaires in the world with money. And if you add another amount that they also have, 8 trillion to that network, work out the maths, what we could do with that money. In their 2023 reports, they say that they have more than they can use. And as we know, that's true. So that doesn't help anyone in terms of poverty. My belief is that housing is a human right. Everybody has the right to a house. Safe, stable, affordable housing was recognised way back in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think both of you and some of you have been in Geneva and you've talked about this, that human right to housing. And since it's been introduced in many treaties, then governments are obliged to do something about this critical situation. The right to housing is more than a roof, of course. It's not enough to say, take the key and there's a house. It needs to be a home. and it's not a commodity or even a shelter. And that's my big passion. Don't just say, and I'm quoting Ireland again, go out to Tala and there's a key and there's your house. That is not enough. A home is the very foundation of family stability. You again, Lorraine, talked about people living in these hotels, you know, getting happy. I disagree with the government so much on that, and I have talked to the minister about it. So a home is the very foundation of family stability, personal belonging and community. The human right to housing is therefore the right to live in a decent home in peace and dignity, and to live in a society where housing is affordable on every level. Key aspects of the right to housing, these are my passions, is secure tenure. It means that you have a place to live in, hopefully for the rest of your life. Housing, land and property rights, and particularly in developing countries where women don't have access to housing and don't have right to land. Equal and non-discriminatory access to adequate housing. Participation in housing-related decision-making and national and community levels. I think that's really something that's important for you in ATD in Ireland, is to really get into that decision-making in relation to housing and policy. The right to choose one's residence. This was one of my big contentions with the government in Ireland, because everybody has the right to choose. It's not what Dublin Corporation or Dublin City Council say, you go to that place. It may not be suitable, it may be broken down, and we just don't deserve just to get anything. We have to have a right to live where we want to live. One of the biggest things I also think is the availability of supportive services. People who are homeless, and both of you described this very well, are traumatized. Traumatized from the experience I'll never forget the words you used, Lorraine, you know, you smell the poverty and all those feelings that brings out for people who've been in that situation. And it's not a life sentence. This is the awful thing. People are not poor forever. They're not homeless forever. It's a period in their lives that needs changing, and we need to support that. So it's not enough just to give somebody a house. They need support with respect and dignity. And I'm not going to go into the SDGs because we've already said them, but I think in them, here at the UN, we have an SDG that does relate to housing. It's in Goal 11, and that everybody deserves the right to housing. And I really think that raises the bar for governments worldwide, that they need to uphold that right to housing. You know, it's not something that's written down. So we need to really approach our governments. And I know we have our member state here, Celine from Haiti. The same thing has to happen for all our countries. We're talking to our member states to represent the people that they do have a voice, but don't get a voice here at the UN. Social and economic justice for all requires a big shift in how we think about people, place, and our planet, and which really helps us to realise human rights for everyone. My policy recommendations to governments are: we urgently seek mechanisms of accountability to ensure states respect their obligations in relation to the right to adequate housing. And that's why I say to you both, you need to stay on top of this with your government representatives. That's why we elect them. They are the people's representative, and we need to do something about it to shift this way that anything will go and anything doesn't go. We need right-based policies, combined housing first, like I just said, housing really with support, however you talk about it. And have legislation and community services, which you're both doing in the inner city. And in some ways, you have good practices, Lorraine and Jimmy. There's some things that have changed, but a lot of things have not changed, as you rightly said. So we as members of civil society are seeking a better future for all our people and calling for a better type of leadership for all. And I think that's the big thing for us, is what our leaders are doing. They need to understand the situation better, which you've just told us, and I couldn't say it in any better way than you've just said it. And I'm going to finish. I'm leaving out lots because I know I was probably running out of time, but I just said this at the opening of the Commission for Social Development yesterday, and I'm going to say it today. And I end, as I always do, remembering the people we represent, you and Lorraine and Jimmy and all those. Don't talk about us without us. All people experiencing extreme poverty need to be included in decision-making spaces at every level, so we can collectively benefit from your insights and innovations and all you've talked about. Then we can have a different world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for reminding us that despite the complexity and severity of poverty, it can be resolved, and also for the policy recommendations that can contribute to the fight against poverty, inequality, and discrimination. Thank you again. Panelists, feel free to add a comment to the conversation. Mr. Schutter.
Thank you. I would like to thank Jean for this very moving comment, and particularly her emphasis on the need to ensure adequate participation of low-income households, of people in poverty, in the decisions that affect them. In fact, participation is too weak a word. I would like to say rather co-decision that is truly empowering and allowing people in poverty to co-construct the solutions that are meant to support them. And I mention this in particular because together with ATD Fourth World, we are now trying to promote a new tool meant for decision makers at all levels, from the local to the national and to the international levels of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. We're trying to promote this tool for effective participation of people in poverty in the decisions that affect them. And we are convinced that it is precisely this expertise that Jean Quinn described that we cannot afford to ignore. Decisions that do not take those views into account, that do not build on that experience of people in poverty, will be ineffective, will address the wrong issues, will not see the very real obstacles that people in poverty face, and ultimately will be a waste of resources. And since Jean has been focusing in her career, particularly on access to housing, I would like to give one example, which is one of the 3 case studies we studied to develop this new tool that we are going to present actually on 15th of February in Washington to the World Bank and the IMF. And that is an example from Mauritius, where a well-intended policy of creating a model village for, in total, 77 households, 77 families to be located there and receiving a small dwelling instead of the shackles where they were living previously. They were relocated in this area. It turned out, however, that this village was at a 2 kilometers distance from their other relatives. They had poor access to public services, to healthcare centers, to schools, because the village was located in an area that was not well served by these services. And as a result, people felt socially isolated. They could not easily invite friends. They could not easily send the children to school because it was at a distance from where they lived. In other terms, the experiment failed. And the experiment failed because this was a very top-down scheme, not involving people in poverty and designing the village in question and deciding on the location based on the opportunity there was to have this financed by some international organization, rather than based on what people expressed as to their desire to maintain their social connections. So I think it is really essential that even the best intended schemes do not do without this experience, and that people in poverty are not just consulted, not just informed, not just asked about their views, but actually from the start of the design of the program to the implementation and to the evaluation of the program, that they are co-participants and co-shape the decisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia, for sharing your thoughts. And we will now listen to Miss Ife Finch-Floyd with a video contribution.
I'm sorry I can't be with you live today, but I hope my remarks help to add to a very thoughtful and dynamic conversation about supporting people with low income and people living in poverty with government assistance. I want to first start with a little bit of vocabulary. I might use some of this terminology throughout my presentation, and I want to make sure that people are clear about what I mean. So the terms safety net, economic security programs, or anti-poverty programs, I will probably use those interchangeably, but mainly what I am talking about are government programs that provide financial support to families and individuals with low income. And then there's work requirements. These are policies that take away government assistance if a person does not comply with strict work or work training rules. So these two lines represent two different measures of poverty in the United States. The orange or yellow line is the official poverty measure, and it really doesn't take into account much government assistance. It mainly considers any other kind of cash income that a person brings into the household. It could be like earnings, for example. The blue line is considered supplemental poverty measures, and it is a more holistic view of all types of support that the government offers to individuals and families. So that is going to include things like that are not necessarily cash transfers, like our food assistance program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which provides benefits for people to use to purchase food, but can't be used to purchase anything else. So these data go back to about the late 1960s. So we get a fairly good perspective of what has happened more than over the past almost 60 years now in American social policy. And what we see when we compare these two trend lines, if we look at that official poverty measure, it might look like we haven't really made much progress. And a lot of legislators like to make this point. But what they fail to look at is this supplemental measure that takes, again, into account more of government's interaction in providing support to families and individuals. And what we see is that blue line consistently has lower levels of poverty than that yellow or orange line. And what it in fact shows is that government programs that support people actually help reduce hardship, actually help reduce poverty. And you can see in the most recent years, a really major drop in poverty. And that was during the pandemic. That's because in 2020 and 2021, our federal government provided taxpayers with cash checks, no strings attached, and other supports that really helped people cover their basic needs during a global pandemic. We could have seen far worse outcomes if the federal government did not take these actions, but instead what we saw is actually reduced hardship. So this is critical. I cannot cover all the important moments in American social policy. I don't have the time to, but I did want to highlight 4 really important moments in that history. I wanted to start with the Great Depression and the Social Security Act of 1935. This was one of the first major kind of expansions of social insurance programs and some safety net programs as well. So we established our unemployment compensation program more formally here, and also a program that we call now Social Security, which is basically the benefits and support that we give to people who are retired or elderly. In addition, this legislation also provided the federal funding for a cash assistance program called Aid to Dependent Children. It will change names multiple times over its lifetime. And this was a cash support program for single mothers, mainly. The original assumption is that it would be for widows who were still taking care of children. While these were major expansions in government supports for working people, for people with low levels of income, there were huge carve-outs in a lot of our social insurance programs in particular that meant that a lot of Black workers couldn't access them. Additionally, in our cash assistance program, it mainly benefited white women and white widows in particular. So if you had a child and you were not married, you might not have gotten assistance in that way. And if you were Black, you were certainly denied assistance. Again, over time, the trends and who made up the population on this cash assistance program certainly shifted. But at the outset, all these programs were set up for white people. About 30 years later, we come to the war on poverty. This was post-World War II, where the United States had a fairly strong economy, and some people actually forgot that poverty was still, in fact, a problem. But there was a renewed awareness. This was also during the Civil Rights era, where African Americans were fighting for, the right to vote and other protections. And we see just a massive amount of effort to reduce economic hardship. So Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on poverty. This in and of itself was a declaration, wasn't legislation, but it spurred legislation like the Food Stamp Act of 1964, which is our food assistance program. It also created our two major health programs, Medicare, which provides health coverage for people who are elderly, and Medicaid, which provides health coverage for people with very low income. Another 30 years later, we have another major piece of legislation that takes aim at addressing programs that serve people with low income. This time, instead of expanding the safety net, this was a way to limit the safety net. After the war on poverty, after the civil rights movement, there was what a lot of experts call a white backlash, really kind of this resentment towards African Americans, towards other people of color, towards women, even getting more rights, more support, and changes in our laws to support these different groups. And in particular, that cash program I mentioned, more Black women, more brown women were able to access cash benefits to support their children. And as a result, there was a lot of racist rhetoric and narratives that defined these women as being irresponsible, as not working, as not wanting to take care of their children, only having babies to get benefits, which certainly played on stereotypes of Black women that were birthed during enslavement. So the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act really came to the fore because a lot of that rhetoric and some of the policy changes in the late 1980s to really push work to the center of the conversation, to say we're not going to allow people to access public benefits for nothing. We want them to do something. There has to be some kind of exchange, and mainly that exchange was work. But there were other requirements as well. So that cash assistance program went through a tremendous transformation, and we saw strict work requirements implemented, time limits, and other changes. Our food program also got an additional level of work requirements as well. And we also saw people, immigrants with documentation, they established a 5-year ban saying you can't access these SNAP benefits if you fall in hard times or any kind of government assistance unless you've been in the country for 5 years. Fast forward to 2010, the US Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. And because we don't have a public healthcare system, Medicaid is critically important for people without healthcare coverage. So this allowed eligibility of Medicaid to expand. However, because of court cases, different states opted in or opted out of expanding Medicaid. A lot of southern states, including my state, Georgia, and these states have a history of enslavement and have a history of segregation, have not expanded Medicaid. So we saw that graph at the beginning. We know these anti-poverty or safety net programs can be effective, but they are not as effective as they could be. If you are to look at any kind of data around poverty, you will always see Black, Latino, and Indigenous people having the highest levels of poverty compared to white and compared to Asian families and individuals. That is consistently, it has been consistent for decades. And it is because of systemic racism in our economic systems, in our labor market, but also in our safety net. And there's this idea of those who are deserving to get access to these programs. So here are 3 key programs, again, where work is really at their core. The cash assistance program that we have today is called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Strict work requirements, time limits, and the funding structure is very limiting as well. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, that's our food assistance program. The work requirements there are not as strict, but they can be pretty punitive. Earned income tax credit allows for people to get a tax refund, people who with low levels of earnings, but you have to be working to get it, earned income tax credit. And the child tax credit, which was conceived in the late 90s, early 2000s, again, was supposed to be support for people with children. But again, you had to have earnings in order to get it. But there's some changes that I'll talk about in this slide. In the past several years, there has been a movement away from safety net programs that are based in kind of, again, with these work expectations or other kinds of restrictions, and a movement towards unrestricted cash. A lot of localities, cities have been experimenting with guaranteed basic income so that if you are below a certain level of income, you get a monthly cash payment, no questions asked. We're not going to track, make sure you used it one way, or not going to penalize you if you use it another way, right? And this has been gaining a lot of momentum. Some localities have used some public funds, but a lot of it is funded with private dollars. And then again, during the during the pandemic, in 2021, the Congress, US Congress, made some critical changes, expansions to that child tax credit that is essentially made it function like a child allowance. They removed the work requirements so that people without earnings, people who have the very least level of income, were able to access it for their children. They expanded the benefit, they increased the benefit, I should say. And then they actually allowed for 6 months people to receive that benefit on a monthly basis. So it, in essence, acted like a child allowance. Unfortunately, Congress decided not to continue that model, but there are conversations in the works to at least try to expand that child tax credit a little bit more so it reaches more people. So I will pause there. Wanted to leave off with kind of this new momentum that we're seeing, but I hope the rest of this conversation goes well.
We thank Ife for being able to add to this conversation. We have seen with her the long-term impact of the Economic Security Program on poverty and hardship. For important moments of the American social policy, the evolution of these programs, the movements which contributed to their evolution, as well as their limits. For now, I would like to thank firstly Jean Quinn, because she has to leave the panel because of another engagement. Thank you so much, Jean Quinn. Have a good day.
I look forward to meeting Lorraine and Jimmy when I retire in Dublin. And can I be on that winning team? Thank you. Take care. Professor Shooter and Celine, thank you. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Please, panelists, please briefly share your thoughts on IP contribution. If you're ready, the floor is yours. If not, I want to thank all of you, all of our panelists for a rich and thought-provoking conversation. We will now turn to the questions from the chat box. I will start with Jimmy and Lauren. We have a question for you both. Can Jimmy and Lauren say more about the Add the 10th campaign?
This is for the regulations for social economic discrimination. There's 9 already, so I wouldn't put in unless you had the 10th. And the 10th one is the groundwork of social economy discrimination jigsaw, which is to stop discrimination from happening all over the place. It helps when you're in homeless services or when you're getting food banks and all, you don't want to be discriminated. So when you look for help, you just don't be you don't want to be looking down. You want to support the people saying, well, look, he needs help and there's something wrong with getting help.
And also, when Jimmy was making his statement earlier on, he was discussing that we've managed to actually get this voted in the Dáil. It didn't go the way we hoped it would go, but we are going to keep fighting. And basically, the examples that I gave you, this law stops that socio-economic discrimination from happening, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. We need this 10th law to be added so the jigsaw puzzle can be completed, and this is why we made it a jigsaw piece. In the background here, we've had a lot of support from people all over the world, just taking photographs or holding the jigsaw piece to show some support. And we would really appreciate it that if we emailed you a photograph of the jigsaw piece, if you could just take a picture and email it back, it would help us a lot with user support too. Thank you.
It's just to bring a campaign together to fight social economy discrimination, because we can't have it go on any longer, because we need to stop it now and make people aware and to stop all discrimination from the young guy since they're small, from small to the adults. They have to stop discrimination.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Lauren. We have another question from the chat that is open for all our panelists. The question is, can housing discrimination status based on poverty be enforced through changing housing application requirements? For example, many housing applications require prospective tenants to prove their monthly income is 3 times that of the rent. If not, how can these types of laws be enforced?
I think the point that was it Celine that was speaking, Celine? I think the point that Celine was making as well, kind of stuck to. I think that our government and other people do need to be more aware of these things and listen to the people and not push these problems to the side like they do with a lot of other things. And it needs to be addressed. And I also feel like not only our government, but a lot of governments need to recognize this problem. And there's only so much we can do as the people. And I'm grateful to give my voice to those who can't use their voice right now. And I don't want to take up too much time either, but I do think that there could be a solution around that. And I liked that Celine mentioned that she did go to the government about that and she is working on that. And I just want to thank her for that on behalf of ATD Ireland, because it is a big struggle with families at the moment living in hotels and B&Bs, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Mr. De Schutter, the floor is yours. The floor is yours. Olivier, I don't know if you can hear me.
Thank you. In fact, this is a question which I had responded to in writing, but I'm glad to express my views on this. Anti-discrimination law increasingly includes this 10th ground of prohibited discrimination grounds in a number of countries, and this is consistent with what international human rights law requires. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights refers to social origin and to property. In Spanish, posición económica. In French, fortune. So you cannot be adversely treated simply because you are poor, because you have no wealth or live on low wages. Now, the implication, it seems to me, is that if you apply to rent an apartment and you can pay whatever the source of income, even if you live on a low wage or depend on social assistance, there is no reason not to rent you that apartment, and the landlord cannot impose anything else than that you pay the rent. So even if you have to dedicate a significant part of your wage to pay for your housing, that should not be a reason to exclude you. That being said, in more and more circumstances, particularly in a city such as Dublin, speculation on housing has been extremely high. The rent levels have been skyrocketing over the past 10, 15 years. And that is, in a way, how prospective tenants are selected, based on their purchasing power, in effect. That is indeed very problematic, and there should be not only social housing programs funded by the government, but in addition, there should be a certain regulation of the level of rent to avoid that kind of speculation occurring in situations where, as a result of the phenomenon described by Lorraine and Jimmy, such as the Airbnb phenomenon, such rent levels are suddenly increasing. And more and more countries, in fact, have in place regulations that limit the increases in the levels of rent that landlords may impose. They may, of course, adapt the rent to the rate of inflation to increase cost of living, but they should not be allowed to go significantly beyond that. And I think it's important to re-emphasize.
Thank you. Merci, Olivier. I don't know if Lauren or Jimmy has some thoughts on it. If we have no more questions, I would like to thank all our panelists, ATD Fourth Ward, for sponsoring this panel, this event, and to all of you for sharing your time with us today and for your questions. Soon, you will be able to access a video of this conversation online, and please feel free to share it with your colleagues and networks. Have a good day. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Celine, for your moderation. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Olivier.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Lorraine.